Welcome to Australia's Future with Tony Abbott. I'm Daniel Wild from the Institute of Public Affairs. Australia is facing its most significant challenges since World War II. Geopolitical tensions are increasing, cultural self-confidence is in decline. The values which define us, freedom, democracy, egalitarianism and sacrifice, are being put to the test. Over this special podcast series, Tony and I discuss how Australia can survive and flourish in the decades ahead. Hello Tony, and g'day to all of our listeners. Wonderful to be with you for another episode of Australia's Future with Tony Abbott. We are very grateful to have former Prime Minister and Distinguished Fellow of the IPA, Tony Abbott, with us for another discussion. Two critical issues to discuss today. That is of Morrison's secret ministries and what it says about the broader handling of COVID around Australia and what we should do about it, and the future of Australia's national defence and security. To begin on our first topic, as we all know by now, based on reports, Scott Morrison as Prime Minister took it upon himself to, in essence, be a second secret minister for 5 portfolios across health, finance, resources, treasury and home affairs. Tony, you've recently said in reports in the Australian Financial Review that what Scott Morrison did was inconsistent with the conventions and practices that form an essential part of the system of responsible government. So just to begin with, Tony, to set the scene, could you elaborate on your observations about the reservations and problems of what Scott Morrison did?
Sure, Dan. And look, I should preface these observations by saying that it was an unprecedented time. While we'll go on to say many things about the pandemic today and beyond, it did strike the whole of our society really out of the blue. Very few of us had been thinking about it. I'd thought about pandemics when I was health minister, for instance, in the Howard government. But I don't think 1 in 1,000 people had thought about a pandemic in any serious way prior to late January, early February and March of 2020. And look, in unprecedented times, people are tempted to do unprecedented things, and some of the things they do because it seems like the right thing at the time subsequently look like they shouldn't have been done. And while I can understand Prime Minister Morrison wanting to, as it were, shadow the health portfolio, particularly given the enormous powers given to the Health Minister under the Biosecurity Act, it is hard to fathom why it was necessary to shadow also finance, treasury, resources and home affairs, particularly given that some of these later shadows happened 12 months or more into the pandemic, and particularly given that none of the later shadows were aware that the Prime Minister was their, in a sense, co-minister. So look, very unusual, very unconventional, and hard to see the point of. And I don't want to be too harsh on Scott because at times leaders do things which bamboozle their followers. I dare say some people thought that I had rather bamboozle them when I brought back knighthoods, for instance. But nevertheless, it was unusual, it was unconventional, and under all the circumstances it was wrong, particularly because it wasn't announced and even the ministers, other than Greg Hunt, didn't know about it. But we've had the report from the Solicitor General. The Solicitor General has made it clear that it was highly unconventional, but it wasn't actually illegal. You might remember, Dan, that back in 1972, Gough Whitlam and Lance Barnard swore themselves into, I think, 25 portfolios. Lance had 13, Gough had 12 for the first fortnight or so of the Whitlam government before more normal arrangements were entered into, and that was because the new government at that time wanted to hit the ground running and start getting things done, like pulling us out of Vietnam and abolishing conscription and so on. So look, not illegal, but certainly highly unusual and done in secrecy deeply unconventional and wrong. And what we need to do is look not just at this. Frankly, I think we know all we need to know about this. We need to look at the whole handling of the pandemic, because it seems to me more than ever that the disease itself was serious, but much more damaging than the disease itself was the response to it. The economic response, in terms of the gargantuan spending that was totally unprecedented outside total war. The lack of democratic accountability, because no Australian Parliament has ever debated pandemic policy in the way that it was occasionally debated in the House of Commons, for instance, when lockdowns and what have you were being imposed or extended. And I think it's damaged us spiritually as well. It's promoted not just a safety first, but a safety only mindset. I think it's done enormous damage to the work ethic of so many Australians. The problems we've got in so many areas at the moment, from hospitality to transport to retailing, getting people to turn up, a continuity of services, flights taking off on time, baggage arriving in the right place at the right time. All of this flows from the disruption that the pandemic caused, and the frankly unnatural behaviour that was imposed upon us by government. I can remember early on, at the time of the first lockdown, government talked about putting the economy into hibernation. Well, we're not bears. We aren't bears. Maybe bears can go to sleep for 6 months and then come to and act normally, but human beings are not like that. And we were essentially put in and out of hibernation on numerous occasions over a 2-year period. That does damage. It does economic damage, it does cultural damage, it does psychic damage. We need to look at all of this and learn the right lessons, because at some point in time there will be another pandemic. It might be a year, it might be a decade, it might be a century, but there will be another one, and we need to distill the lessons of this one as part of our duty to the future. We need to distill the lessons of this one and give it to future generations for their own benefit.
And it was on this podcast, as you reminded me just before, that you first made the call that there should be a Royal Commission into the handling of COVID, because I agree that what Morrison did was unconventional and I think just plain wrong. But it gets to this much broader issue, as you've identified, of the lack of transparency and accountability that came with the entire handling of COVID, and mostly at the state level. I mean, there's lots of scrutiny, quite rightly, on Scott Morrison, but where's the scrutiny on Daniel Andrews? Where's the scrutiny on the state premiers for what they did? So I think your assessment's correct, 100%.
And the Royal Commission, Dan, it has to be an exploratory Royal Commission, as opposed to a whitewash Royal Commission. There are some inquiries which are designed to cover things up. I think there was one in Victoria here.
Sure there was.
Into hotel quarantine.
Yeah.
And there are other inquiries that are designed to elucidate and to educate. And we need an elucidation and education Royal Commission into the totality of our response to the pandemic.
Just one other question on this, because that's a pretty comprehensive treatment of the matter. One of the more curious things what Morrison did is, so far, what we know is the only time he used his power was not related to the pandemic. It was to get rid of a gas project, the IPA gas project in the Sydney Basin at a time when Australia is in the middle of an energy crisis. That, I think, is deeply concerning, because it appears to have been done purely for political motives, to try and save the seats of some inner city seats in Sydney. So that, to me, was one of the more concerning developments, to use that power for what seemed to be political purposes. Did you have any reflections on that particular matter, or not so much?
Well, look, Dan, why shouldn't we know what resources we have. Whether we decide to exploit them or not is another story. But surely if there are deposits of gas and oil off the coast of New South Wales, let's know about them. Now, I suspect that we are going to be using fossil fuels for a long time to come if we want to maintain our standard of living and if we want to maintain our position as a first world economy, an independent first world economy. And if we are going to be using fossil fuels, as I think we have no real alternative, let's see what resources might exist off the coast of New South Wales. I mean, the Bass Strait has been an important source of wealth and development for Victoria over many, many decades. If the Bass Strait wasn't running down, gas prices in Victoria would probably be rather lower than they are. Maybe there's another Bass Strait somewhere off the coast of New South Wales, and why shouldn't we know about it?
No, look, I agree, and I would just note that Madeleine King, who's the Resources Minister, has, I think, made some positive overtures recently, opening up some offshore oil and gas exploration potential. So that's, I think, a positive step in the right direction. But I completely share your views that let's see what's out there, and if we can take the next step to develop them, then so much the better.
Yeah.
Speaking of, you used a critical word there, which was an independent first world power, and the key word independent, I think, and that segues nicely into the next topic, which is to do with our national defence and security. And you gave I think, a very important speech to the Henry Jackson Society in London recently, and there was an edited extract of that published in The Australian along with a news report. And you talked about a range of matters concerning the future of the Western world. And I wanted to focus on what I think are a couple of very important comments that you make. And to begin with, let me quote to you a part of what you said in that speech. You say, quote, "Plainly, what is needed is a rapid resurgence of the democracy's military power, economic strength, and cultural self-confidence. Yet it is hard to see any of this being led from Washington, where the administration is focused on correcting perceived racial injustice, even though minorities have never had a fairer go, and combating what it calls a climate emergency." I'll end the quote there, but you go on to elaborate on that point. Tony, to begin with, could you sort of set the scene for us about your observations and your concerns about an American-led world order and what that means for Australia's future?
There's no doubt, Dan, that under the Pax Americana, which has essentially existed since 1945, the world as a whole has been freer, fairer and richer than ever before. Yes, bad things have happened, but on balance, humanity is in a better position today than ever before. And that's because America and its allies, principally Britain, but including Australia, have maintained a liberal world order in which other countries can develop peacefully. And this has been an extraordinary blessing to all of us. Understandably, since the forever wars of the Middle East, the American people have been questioning whether they should be spending so much blood and treasure to do things which benefit others more than them. And I made a speech in Washington a couple of years back where I basically said that the legions are coming home and we need to understand that. And we need to be prepared to step up ourselves. Now, if anything, the situation has got much more serious since then. We've got the war in Ukraine, which is utterly, totally unprovoked aggression by a dictator with vast ambitions to establish Russia's overlordship of Eastern Europe. And we've got China, which for several decades we thought was pursuing a more liberal course, now very obviously putting the period of hide and bide behind it and very belligerently indeed asserting its claims to, in the first instance, dominate the region and ultimately the wider world. And Taiwan is the key flashpoint. It's absolutely the key flashpoint. Xi Jinping, the new emperor in Beijing has said time and time again that it is the historic mission of the Communist Party to take Taiwan by force if necessary. There's obviously quite a bit of history there, and the whole Chiang Kai-shek era in Taiwan complicates it a bit. But the fact is that for the best part of 40 years, Taiwan has been a liberal, pluralist democracy of 23 million people, and there is no way on God's earth that those people should be made to subject themselves to the brutality of the Beijing regime. And yet, unless the democracies, Taiwan's fellow democracies, can raise the cost to Beijing of any attempt to take Taiwan, I think it's almost inevitable that an attempt will be made. Now, we don't know how the attempt might be made, whether it would be by an economic squeeze, perhaps leading to a physical blockade, whether it might be by a cross-straits invasion, D-Day style, or whether it might be, as Senator Jim Molan, the former general, has speculated recently, a Pearl Harbor-style sneak attack on American forces in the Western Pacific, rendering them effectively inoperable and exposing all of America's allies, Japan, South Korea, and indeed Australia, to very, very difficult threats from China to become tributaries or else face an unequal war. Who knows? But I think we can be absolutely certain, as long as Xi Jinping or one of his fellow commissars are in charge in Beijing, that there will be an attempt to take Taiwan by force. Now, when I was in Taiwan last year, the Taiwanese thought it was a couple of years away. The Americans seem to think that it won't be until about 2027 that the Chinese will be sufficiently confident of their amphibious assault capability and their anti-submarine warfare capability to risk an attack on Taiwan. But 2027 is 5 years away. 5 years away. And if a conflict breaks out, you come to the conflict with what you've got. Now, at the moment, Australia's military forces are pitifully inadequate for any sustained conflict other than the sort of minor expeditionary wars that we have been engaged in the Middle East sporadically over the last couple of decades. It really is way beyond time for a serious increase in Australia's independent military power and much more substantial cooperation between the democracies of the Indo-Pacific to try to ensure that Taiwan is not subjected to the kind of brutality that Ukraine is currently having to endure. Because while the conflict in Ukraine is incredibly serious and has already led to much disruption, which will do enormous ongoing damage to the cost of living, particularly of people in Western Europe, any attempt by China to take Taiwan by force will completely convulse the modern world. Trade patterns would be completely and absolutely disrupted. Standards of living would crash dramatically. And of course, that's without a fight. But add the fight, which I think should be entered into in order to try to protect the well-being of the people, the free people of Taiwan. Then you've got the risks of escalation and the near certainty of heavy casualties, even if the fight can be localised in the way that the Korean War was. So there are enormous things that need to be taken into account. And there are massive preparations that need to be made. A, to try to prevent the fight, but B, to ensure that if the fight comes, the democracies can win, because at the moment it's far from certain.
Well, just to build on a couple of points there that you make, Tony, in your speech, what you say, quote, Australia needs to end decades of strategic complacency because leaving the heavy lifting to others is unworthy and unwise, end quote. I'd be interested to get your assessment of what are the major things Australia should be doing in order to prepare ourselves for a fight, whether that's in relation to Taiwan or in some other theatre. For me, there's sort of three headline things. One is developing our own offensive capabilities. The second is having energy independence, so we can have our own sovereign industry and manufacturing capabilities to be able to produce things here rather than relying on supply chains. And the third is cultural self-confidence, which is a major issue in terms of a nation whose people don't believe in its own values or history are unlikely to bring their best selves to a fight. So for me, those are, I guess, three major components. Be interested in your perspective, Tony.
Well, naturally, you're right, Dan. We do have to be militarily more powerful, economically stronger, and culturally more self-confident. We absolutely need to do all those things. But the immediate problem is the Beijing regime eyeing Taiwan and constantly calculating whether they can get away with an attempt to seize that democratic island. And what I think we need to do as a matter of great urgency is talk seriously to our partners and allies about various contingencies and what the response might be to them. One of the things that the Morrison government did very well was complete the reciprocal access agreement negotiations, which my government had started with Japan, which would enable the basing of Japanese forces in Australia and of Australian forces in Japan. I think we should be talking to the Japanese government about moving some of our submarines and some of our planes to bases in Japan, because then they would be in a position to be effective were any adverse developments to occur in the Straits of Taiwan. In all things, we need to emphasise that we seek no conflict with anyone. We want everyone to live in peace. But while you hope for the best, you've got to prepare for the worst. And I think our problem is that we have been, if I may say so, sleepwalking through Lotus Land here. And while I would be the first to concede that as late as 2015, I had an optimistic, benign view of China, the developments since then have made crystal clear the fact that the Beijing regime has malign intentions towards all its neighbours, but particularly towards Taiwan. We just have to look at what's happened to the Uyghurs. We have to look at what's happened to Hong Kong. We have to look at the increasingly draconian treatment of China's own citizens to see the nature of this regime. And if any further demonstration of its belligerence were needed, it was the response of the Chinese military to the recent visit of Nancy Pelosi to Taiwan. Now, why shouldn't the Speaker of the US House of Representatives be able to pay a courtesy call on Taiwan? What's the problem? Now, the fact that the Beijing regime reacted so hysterically to this perfectly reasonable visit should have alerted people right around the world to the ominous potential in this area.
I want to ask you a question that might be considered to be pushing the boat out of fraction, but I think it gets to the seriousness of of the challenge of China. Do you think there's any circumstances where some kind of preemptive strike on China's military capabilities would be warranted, or that itself would be too provocative?
Look, I think I would not for a second entertain any such thought. As I said, I think that the posture of the democracies has got to be, we want peace. We want everyone to live as best they can by their own standards, without threat, without oppression. We want every government over time to become more decent and more liberal, but we accept that every country will do its own thing. The important thing is that no one country tries to pressure another. And in the case of China and Taiwan, you've got a democracy of 23 million people, which is now being bullied on a daily basis by an autocracy of 1.4 billion. There was a quote I saw today, and I'm trying to remember it, from Edmund Burke, something like this: when bad men combine, the good must associate, else they fall. Else they fall, an unpitied sacrifice in a contemptible struggle. Now, when the people of Taiwan are subject to the kind of bellicose threats that they're getting from Beijing, it's only right and proper that their fellow democracies should rally to their help. And again, I'm not saying that there should be an explicit change to the one China policy. I'm not even saying there should be an explicit change to the doctrine of strategic ambiguity. But I think some signals need to be sent, backed up by actions that show that we're serious. Some signals need to be sent to the Beijing government that Taiwan is not alone. And I think the consideration of basing some Australian military units in Japan would be an important way of us doing our bit to send the right signals to Beijing.
I'd like to just round out our discussion on this issue to get your reflections on the domestic...
And that quote, by the way, is from Edmund Burke.
Edmund Burke, yeah. All right, very good. No, it's a very apt quote. To get your assessment of the domestic political nature of this in Australia, you were, as Prime Minister, somebody who had broad-based support throughout a range of communities across our country, whether it's Indian communities, Chinese, people of all different backgrounds. I think your leadership appealed to them in many different ways. What we've seen in reports over the last couple of months is that it's been put to people like Peter Dutton and other in the Liberals that too much of a, if you want to call it aggressive or even just a clear stance on the Chinese Communist Party is off-putting to Australians of Chinese heritage, and therefore you might need to augment your messaging. Now, I find that, firstly, I question the premise of that. I'm not sure it's true, because when you and I are talking, we're not talking about Chinese citizens. They are victims of the Chinese Communist Party as much as anybody else. We're talking about the regime. But I would just be interested, from your perspective, how do you manage what is clearly a very challenging dialogue that needs to be had with the Australian people on this matter?
Yeah, and I think you're right to raise that, Dan. I've tried in everything I've said about the darkening strategic scene to differentiate between the Chinese people and the current Chinese government, and that's why I've talked about Beijing as opposed to China wherever I can, and the Chinese Communist Party as opposed to the Chinese people wherever I can. Unfortunately, sometimes we do get into sort of shorthand talking. We say China when we mean the current Chinese government. And it is understandable that people of Chinese background living in Australia can become slightly apprehensive and feel perhaps slightly out of sorts when they hear this kind of talk. I just want to say that as far as I'm concerned, Australia is a nation of migrants. We always have been. Certainly modern Australia always has been. We always will be and should be. And the fact that we've welcomed migrants from the four corners of the earth who have promptly joined Team Australia and made a wonderful life for themselves and indeed a richer and a better life for all of us is greatly to our credit as a nation. And just as I suppose the English and the Irish and the Scots were predominantly the early ones, in more recent times we've had more than 1 million come from China and the Chinese diaspora. We've got almost 1 million who've come recently from India. We've had hundreds of thousands from Vietnam and elsewhere. All of these people, and from the Middle East, all of these people have become wonderful Australians. And the last thing any of us want to do is to make any Australian feel like a stranger in his or her own country or unwelcome in the country. But nevertheless, we do have to be clear-eyed about the fact that the current Chinese government is on the march, just as the Russian dictator is on the march in Europe. It hasn't come to wide-scale conflict in our part of the world the way it has in Ukraine, but nevertheless, the aggressive intent is clearly there, and it needs to be suitably responded to by the democracies. And look, in the long run, this isn't just about us. This is about the people of China as much as anything, because one day Chinese people should not just be able to look forward to a materially better life, they should be able to look forward to a politically and spiritually, and if they choose culturally, better life as well. And this is why the Beijing regime finds Taiwan so toxic, because Taiwan is living, breathing proof that there is no totalitarian gene in the Chinese DNA. And that's one of the many reasons why the Beijing government is so keen to take Taiwan as quickly as possible and do at least to Taiwan what it's currently doing to Hong Kong.
It's a great point you make, Tony. And let's just finish on, I just want to finish on one other component of this, because this sort of comes back to what you and I talk about a lot, which is the importance of values. And so many people that have come from China to Australia have done so because they want freedom, family, set up their small businesses and live a peaceful life. They've escaped the Chinese brutality for a country like Australia. I'll put this in my own words and simply saying I think it's a core component of national defence is for the coalition to talk about our values. It's what brings us together as a nation. You were always very big on Team Australia. No matter what your background is, if you're a permanent Australian citizen, you have a stake in our nation, and our freedom, democracy, egalitarianism, our way of life is for all Australians. And I think sometimes perhaps the coalition and the centre-right have not been comfortable in talking with migrant communities about those values, but I think it would actually bring them on the journey with us and overcome some of these issues. So I just wanted to reflect on that.
Very fair point. And one of the great contributions of my former parliamentary colleague Philip Ruddock to the Liberal Party, particularly in New South Wales, but around Australia, has been to reach out to recent migrant communities and welcome them into the fold. And certainly the Liberal Party in New South Wales, that I'm very familiar with, is much more reflective of the social realities of modern Australia today than it was 20 or 30 years ago when I first went into Parliament. And Philip had a big hand in that, and he deserves all Liberals' gratitude, and indeed all Australians' gratitude for that. I've always thought myself that migrant communities should naturally resonate with Liberal Party values, because you come to Australia, what are you on about? Invariably, you're on about family, education, getting ahead, and that normally means small business. And these are very much things that resonate or should resonate with the Liberal Party. So I think that the Liberal National Coalition should be the natural party for the recent migrant. But all too often in the past, I think we were a bit standoffish, and that certainly must not be true of the future.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I reckon that's a great topic for a future conversation, because there's a lot to talk about there. But for today, we'll leave it there. So as always, really greatly appreciate your insights and your advice and analysis, Tony. So thank you once again.
Dan, can I just,
of course,
if I may, finish on this one point? If the Americans think that 2027 is the likely time for a Chinese attempt to take Taiwan, that gives us 5 years to prepare. Now, I saw that we're now thinking about possibly getting more air warfare destroyers, but we're still talking about the late 20s or the early 30s. We have got to ramp this up. We really have got to ramp this up because we just cannot assume that a conflict, if it occurs, is going to give us adequate warning to suddenly start doing all the things that should be done now. One of the things that really hit me, Dan, when I was Prime Minister, and as Prime Minister, you've got to think about the substance in a way that as opposition leader, you probably don't have to. I mean, opposition is probably more theatre than substance. Government has got to be more substance than theatre. And what really hit me, first in the context of the energy debate, and second in the context of the defence procurement debate, is that decisions that governments make or fail to make now critically impact on the choices that governments have, indeed the fate the nation has 5, 10, 20 years down the track. And so any negligence in terms of our military capacity now could put us in an incredibly perilous position in 5 or 10 years' time. That's why I think there should be an extreme urgency about trying to beef up our armed forces' weight and clout and capacity, and the kind of gentle over-the-horizon expansion that we've been talking about, nuclear submarines by 2040, an extra 20,000 military personnel within 2 decades. We have got to have, everything has got to be accelerated massively.
No, thanks, Tony. I think that the ramping it up, I'd like to talk to you about maybe next time what ramping it up means and to you what it might look like, because I think that's a very important topic, and there are a few other voices out there making this case. So, Tony, thank you once again.
Thank you, Dan.
This is a production of the Centre for the Australian Way of Life at the Institute of Public Affairs. To find out more, visit australia.ipa.org.au.